Yuki Nagato was created for one singular purpose. Commanded by the Data Integration Thought Entity, she was to monitor and observe Haruhi Suzumiya. The entity became fascinated by Haruhi's almost supernatural ability to create what the entity referred to as data from seemingly nothing. Haruhi's existence might serve the entity's own understanding and goal of auto-evolution. As a result, the entity created Nagato, among other interfaces, to see what it could learn. For 3 years after the entity first detected Haruhi, Nagato sat alone in an apartment, observing silently, never straying from her mission, all the while forming an identity that Haruhi would later use to fill in the required 5 club members of her eventual SOS brigade. Nagato's presence was laconic, offering few words beyond technical science fiction jargon. She never smiled, she never did anything to call too much attention to herself, and she silently sat in the North High Literature Club room day after day, always reading at high speeds. The question that naturally arises from this kind of mannerism is, does Nagato have a personality for herself, or was the entirety of who she is dictated by the data integration thought entity? It is true that Nagato is of the entity, so the blueprint of who she is was indeed dictated by it. But such a reading of Nagato as a character disregards the impact of the outside world upon her. In no way was this more evident than in an unexpected way, and from, presumably, the most ordinary of people. Nagato's observations of Haruhi would take on an unexpected turn when Haruhi struck up conversations with Kyon, eventually roping him into becoming the first real member of the SOS Brigade besides herself. Kyon's initial interactions with Nagato in the literature club room were what we might reasonably call brief, blunt, and with a slight air of social aloofness. But Kyon's introduction to the SOS Brigade was not something that Nagato nor the entity predicted would happen. The result was that Nagato developed 2 things that would color her character for the rest of the franchise: trust and curiosity. She, and we can presume the entity by extension, found Kyon an irregularity, an unseen element that has managed to inexplicably weave its way into Haruhi's life. It was perhaps at this point that Nagato or the entity decided that they must likewise come to know and understand Kyon. After receiving the hint in a bookmark that Nagato left behind for him, Kyon met with Nagato at her apartment. It is ironic that, for the character who most often has the least amount to say, she would serve as being the proper introduction to the more supernatural universe of the series for Kyon. Their conversation caused Kyon to liken her to an alien, and while Kyon found all this information not only hard to take in, but even harder to believe, he began to find that there were elements of truth to it. Asahina and Koizumi would tell their own versions of what they thought Haruhi was, as well as that connection to 3 years ago that set the events of the series into their proper motion. Regardless of whether Kyon believed Nagato at first, or whether he had any reason to doubt what she said, Nagato made it clear that she would protect him, as his presence in Haruhi's life was too unusual to ignore. When Asakura acted outside the bounds of her orders, Nagato defended Kyon from death and erased Asakura altogether. As she was repairing her body, she forgot to reconstruct her glasses, but a comment from Kyon about how she looks better without them stopped her from doing so. It's reasonable to assume that this is the first time that Nagato was ever told something about her appearance that she took somewhat seriously. She could have reconstructed the glasses, as that was part of her physical persona the data integration thought entity created for her. But in the back of her mind, she must have thought, what do I look like without them? A curious thought indeed. Nagato and Kyon's relationship would develop first from a sense of alienation and eventually become a rather peculiar breed of friendship. While they never really spent time together outside of the club room or club activities, unless the members besides Haruhi needed to discuss a Haruhi-related matter, Nagato proved invaluable to Kyon and to the SOS Brigade on multiple occasions. Whether it was through her technological skill or through her own seemingly supernatural powers, she made her mark on everyone surrounding her. The Asakura attack, the Cricket attack, the Sleeping Beauty hint, and the Day of Sagittarius battle with the Computer Club members made it clear that Nagato was Kyon's ally, and that he could trust when things got dangerous. and Kyon responded in kind with giving Nagato reason to trust him as well. He stood up to Haruhi and said that Nagato could spend time with the computer club if she was curious about the technology. When Nagato had taken Haruhi's directions literally and would not open the bedroom door during the typhoon, Kyon rescinded Haruhi's order and gave a new one without her permission, and told Nagato to open it. Kyon had clearly developed a recognition for what Nagato had done for him, and in small, occasional defiance of Haruhi, allowed Nagato to explore more of the world around her. He reassured her that it was indeed okay to allow her other curiosities to be satiated. While he never verbalized the thought out loud, he wondered in Misaligned through soliloquy whether Nagato had other interests and whether she got lonely. That loneliness reached an apex in Endless 8. Connected to the data integration thought entity, only Nagato alone could understand the sheer madness and existential suffocation that being trapped in an endless loop could entail, forced to remember all 15,000 plus iterations of that summer. Her dread was so pronounced that Kyon noticed the subtle ways in which she seemed different somehow. Due to her programming to observe and not actively interfere, she was bound by her orders to maintain the status quo. But in a moment of defying all the odds, Kyon succeeded. This ordinary person in an otherwise extraordinary setting managed to do what no one else could. He broke the loop. He had earned Nagato's trust again. How curious. But Nagato's curiosity would ultimately take on an earth-shaking proportion. As Kyon awoke one day to a world without Haruhi or Koizumi, with Asakura revived, and where Asahina and Tsuruya did not recognize him, he was left with seemingly nowhere to go. But there was one thing that he might be able to bank on. He sought the one member of the SOS Brigade that he could trust more than any other. He went to find Nagato. But the Nagato before him was not the same. Not only had her glasses returned, she likewise seemingly didn't know who he was, and seemed more overtly emotional. She extended an offer to join the literature club since the SOS Brigade no longer existed. She was also more forward. She invited Kyon to her apartment for tea, and regaled him an alternate version of the famous library sequence from the TV series, for which she thanked him. When Kyon asked if he could come back to the club room, she smiled. It is easy to read Nagato changing the world altogether, as well as her mannerisms after the change, as having a romantic undertone. With the blushing, and especially in light of Asakura's discussion with Kyon in the elevator, the subtext is certainly there. But the idea that this new version of Nagato would fall in love with Kyon so quickly, even considering the idea that the library story could have developed her feelings over the course of 7 months, I think underscores the true essence of their relationship. When Nagato shaped the world and created the new version of herself, she did not create a version of herself that was meant to fall in love with Kyon, or somehow carry over her love for Kyon in the original timeline with the new timeline. Instead, what carried over was this deep trust that I have spoken of, that although Kyon was mostly a stranger in this new timeline, she could rely on him and trust his decisions. That is the instinct that was embedded in the new Nagato. It is part of the reason why she did not fight Kyon's decision not to join the literature club even though it broke her heart, and why she did not leave the club room when Kyon went to go find Haruhi and Koizumi at the other school. In addition to her gentler, shy demeanor, she trusted he would return. And he did, albeit not with the final result she expected. Her curiosity likewise carries over into the alternate reality. Why should this boy help her at the library, or visit the clubroom and spout all this nonsense about aliens, Haruhi, and an SOS brigade? And in the greater context of the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya movie beyond the new Nagato, what would Kyon do if he had the chance to keep the changed world as it was? Would he remain, or would he take the opportunity to set everything back to normal again? She took it upon herself with no input to change the world, so she would have to take it upon herself to accept whatever decisions were born from that. She trusted Kyon to make the decision, an entire scenario crafted from her own boredom-induced curiosity. One common interpretation of these events in particular that you'll often see in comments online are takes like, Nagato didn't deserve to have this happen to her, or that Kyon was insensitive to Nagato's feelings. There's a YouTube video that I left a comment on 5 years ago as of this writing, under my original YouTube account name Classical Central, which I'll expand upon here. Nagato did indeed create an altered world, but the world she created was far from perfect. Aside from people getting sick and there being no supernatural phenomena, she brought back Asakura, who demonstrated her old, murderous tendency, that last aspect clearly not on purpose. Asakura was there, for all intents and purposes, to keep Nagato safe and protected. To use her own term, the neighborhood friend was her function. But as such, with that lethal component of her personality still present, there was no way of knowing when Asakura's lethality would crop up. Asakura herself even says that if Nagato got hurt, the action would never be forgiven, and considering that any number of things could result in Asakura interpreting something as a threat, it could be mistakenly taken as a sign to get aggressive. Intentionally or not, the fact is that Asakura did not trust Kyon to the same extent that Nagato did. Remember, if the narrative is to be believed, then if Kyon truly wanted to restore the world back to the way it was, nothing should have gotten in the way when the moment came. But by her own autonomous interpreting of the situation on that cold street, Asakura tried to take the decision out of Kyon's hands by trying to kill him. Kyon himself so pointedly said, Nagato would never wish for this. But Nagato's wish and Asakura's understanding of what Nagato wants do not coincide in the altered world. As Asakura said, I'm here now. Emphasis on the I'm. No protector like Asakura or other alterations were worth the price of Kyon nearly dying. In that sense, Nagato, albeit unintentionally, harmed the trust between them. The conversation on the roof at the hospital is a re-establishment of that trust, and that Kyon himself failed to realize just what Nagato had been enduring this whole time she had observed Haruhi. And when her existence was threatened for defying the data integration thought entity, Kyon fought to protect her. As terrible as the world rewriting was, it would not break the trust that they had in one another. It is a trust that is not romantic, but platonically curious and trusting nevertheless. And that is why Nagato saying a sincere thank you is one of the franchise's most magical moments. It is the first real expression of feeling she had in her original form, and as later light novels in the franchise would attest, that trust is still plentifully, beautifully there. Whether it be in the form of a manifestation of Kyon visiting her to solve a puzzle, or expressing the perplexity of her existence through poetry, or a love confession from a fellow classmate, Nagato's world grows ever more curious. Yuki Nagato was indeed created for one singular purpose, but through the SOS Brigade and especially through the mutual trust between her and Kyon, she learned to gradually break the boundaries of what the data integration thought entity had intended for her. It was not a completely radical transformation or rewrite of who she was, but it allowed her space to let her own curious nature be satiated. She was still Nagato, but she was not the same Nagato. This was a Nagato that gradually learned to think, feel, and decide for herself. She was and is still of the entity, but she is also, more than anything now, of herself. A true evolution that the data integration thought entity never could have provided for her.
"音もない世界